I work in a secret deep-sea research facility. Something is trying to get in. They told me it would feel like being born again. That was the expression used by the orientation officer at the Naval Air Station where my assignment began. Birth into darkness. That's what she said. I assumed it was just a dramatic metaphor. I had passed psych evals, undergone decompression tolerance testing, been vaccinated for things most doctors had only read about in Cold War archives. And I had signed a non-disclosure contract thick enough to knock out a grown man. The kind with paragraph headings redacted and entire clauses that begin with, "In the event of total blackout of authority structures." They told me I would be deployed to a facility called DFD-12, located in the Hadal Zone of the Pacific, over 10,000 meters below the surface. The location, classified. The purpose, partially disclosed as deep-sea biological observation and seismological correlation. The transportation method. A triple-hull pressurized drop pod with carbon nanotube mesh, sealed with a biothermal interface and guided descent AI. I was alone inside it. They called it the womb. I didn't know how long the descent took. The clock display on the inside was intentionally removed, replaced by an old-school analog pressure dial that stopped being useful after the first hour. Time distorted. There were no windows, only a blank gray interior with a faint blue glow, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The AI didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then it answered in short, functional phrases. Cabin pressure nominal. Biovitals stable. Trajectory lock confirmed. No small talk. No music. No sense of motion except for a subtle hum that built steadily behind my ears. I tried not to think about the pressure increasing outside. I tried not to think about what might happen if the hull so much as flexed. At 10,000 meters, even a hairline crack would turn my body into vapor in less than a second. I passed through layers of silence. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but something else. Something physical. Dense. Coiling. There were moments when I swore I could hear things beyond the hull, like whispers caught between the folds of the ocean. They weren't words. Not exactly. But the rhythm of them felt deliberate. Pulses like syllables. At one point, I heard what sounded like 3 faint knocks on the exterior. I told myself it was structural settling. The AI said nothing. The pod adjusted orientation at least twice. Each time there was a shift in gravity, a feeling that down had redefined itself again and again. By the 3rd hour, or what I guessed was the 3rd hour, I stopped trying to guess how far I'd come. I stopped thinking about the surface. I started feeling like I'd been inverted, like my thoughts were draining downward. Every breath felt heavier, every memory more distant. The final stage of the descent was announced with a single sentence. Docking in progress. Remain still. There were no windows, no dramatic view of the base coming into focus through ocean murk. Just the sensation of slowing, a mechanical hiss, and a distant metallic clunk that echoed through the hull like a closing tomb. Then silence. The kind of silence that stretches into the bones. The kind that makes your heartbeat feel intrusive. A soft hiss followed, the seal decompressing, and then the floor beneath me vibrated once. The hatch opened upward. The first thing I saw was a light so white it felt artificial, like it had never touched air before. 2 figures in dark pressurized suits stood motionless in front of me, their helmets blank, their movements rehearsed. No greetings, no nods. One of them gestured for me to follow. The hallway I stepped into wasn't metal like I expected. It was some kind of synthetic composite, smooth and matte-like stone but slightly soft underfoot. The air was cold and dry and smelled faintly of antiseptic and salt. The corridor sloped downward at an angle that made walking feel slightly off balance. I was taken through 3 decontamination chambers, each more intrusive than the last. Microscopic heat sprays, biofilm analysis, retinal and dental scans. One technician swabbed my earlobes and tongue with a thin metal strip that vanished into a wall panel. After an hour of silent processing, I was brought into orientation. It wasn't a room. It was more like a dark amphitheater, with a curved, transparent wall facing what I assumed was open ocean. But there was nothing to see. Only black. A kind of black that swallowed light. The man who greeted me wore a different kind of uniform, darker and lined with copper threading. He had no name tag. He introduced himself as Shift Director Lysander, and told me I would be working under the Neural Observation Unit. My role, he said, was to monitor anomalies in cognitive and psychological output from long-term personnel stationed here, and to assist in baseline recalibrations. He handed me a small tablet with no ports or buttons. It glowed dimly and displayed only two options: accept post and request ascent. I looked at the ascent option. Lysander said nothing. I tapped accept post. The screen flickered once and then went blank. He nodded and turned away, as if that single moment had sealed something irreversible. And perhaps it had. They didn't show me the living quarters that day. They took me directly to my station. Sublevel 4, Corridor B, Unit 23. A room with no windows, one bed, one sink, a camera embedded in the ceiling, and walls covered in noise-dampening foam. My first meal was already there, still steaming. Rice, fish, something green. The tray had no utensils. The lights dimmed on their own after 30 minutes. That night, if it was even night, I didn't sleep. Not because I wasn't tired, but because I kept hearing something from the vents, a rhythmic clicking. Too regular to be mechanical, too subtle to be a fault. It sounded curious. At 3:14 a.m., the screen on the wall turned on by itself. It showed a live camera feed of the external docking bay. The screen read, "No scheduled arrivals." But there was something on the edge of the frame. Something pressing against the exterior glass. It didn't move. But I swear, it was watching. The screen blinked, flickered, and went black. I waited. And that's when I heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not from the hallway, but from beneath the floor. The moment the elevator capsule latched into Dock Module 6B, I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Not in a metaphorical sense, not some anxious premonition clawing at the back of my neck, but a physical sensation, the kind that bypasses thought entirely and pulses straight through the gut. Something about the stillness in the air, or the texture of the walls, or maybe even the way my boots touched the floor. It didn't feel like arrival. It felt like intrusion. The docking corridor was dimly lit by a series of pale ceiling tubes that flickered too slowly to be accidental. The walls, lined with condensation despite the internal regulation, bore subtle scars, microscopic abrasions, and uneven weld lines, as if the structure had been forced to settle after a shift that wasn't meant to happen. 2 figures met me at the threshold of the airlock. They didn't speak. One scanned my retina while the other held a tablet to confirm my clearance. Their eyes were vacant in a way that didn't come from fatigue, but from a rehearsed suppression of instinct. Not obedience. Surrender. I followed them through a maze of passageways, ventilation chambers, and decompression junctions until we reached the primary living deck. Only then did one of them glance back at me and say, "You'll feel it your second night. Don't talk about it." Then they left, the doors sealing behind them with a hiss that seemed too loud for a room this deep. The base was built with utility in mind. No windows, no recreational areas beyond a Spartan mess hall, and no open corridors. Everything was angled, reinforced, deliberately claustrophobic. It was less a research facility and more a bunker, a final shelter meant to endure something none of us were ever supposed to name. My assigned quarters were barely wider than a train compartment. Metal bunk, plastic sink, a desk with no drawers, and a wall-mounted display that had no manual interface. Systems are remote-activated only, I'd been told. I unpacked the standard-issue uniform, folded and vacuum-sealed, and sat down to get used to the idea that I would not see the surface again for another 8 months. Then the first creak came. It was subtle, like a metal groan resonating through a distant hallway, the kind of sound you'd expect from cooling pipes or pressure realignment valves. Except it repeated. Once. Twice. A pause. Then again. A rhythm, not unlike breath. I stepped into the hall, thinking perhaps it was a neighbor settling in. But the corridor was empty, utterly silent. I pressed my hand to the wall. The vibration was faint, but unmistakable. And then I realized something that should have made the sound mundane, its direction. It wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the floor. During orientation, we were briefed extensively on pressure behavior. At depths exceeding 10,000 meters, the external forces on the structure reach levels that no human could experience directly and survive. The facility's hull, we were told, is built with concentric alloy layers designed to flex microscopically under stress, transferring force in a dynamic way to prevent microfractures. We were warned about occasional creaks, pops, even groans. But they would be rare, random, and always a byproduct of pressure displacement. They would never be rhythmic. And pressure doesn't creak like that. I tried to ignore it. Told myself it was in my head, the echo of a long descent, the phantom memory of motion. But that night, it returned. 3 distinct groans, separated by silence. Then a subtle metallic rattle beneath my bed, like something brushing against the exterior hull. I asked one of the engineers the next morning, an older man with deep-set eyes and fingers stained with lubricant. He looked at me for a long time, expression unreadable, then simply muttered, "It happens sometimes. Best to wear earplugs." But I saw the way his jaw clenched when I mentioned the rhythm. I saw how his hand twitched slightly at the word creak. In the mess hall, people avoided eye contact. Conversations were brief, technical, void of anything personal. One woman sitting 3 tables down from me had a nervous tic. She kept glancing at the ceiling, as if she could hear something no one else could. Another man at the food dispenser seemed lost in thought, his lips moving silently, eyes fixed on a crack in the wall that no one else seemed to notice. On the second night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the bunk, still fully dressed, watching the red indicator light above the door blink with each rotation of the internal ventilation cycle. The noise started at 02:46. First the groans, then something new, a hollow clunk, like a steel plate being hit from underneath by a soft, glancing blow. Not a strike, a knock. I sat up. The walls did not vibrate. The ceiling did not flex. But the floor beneath my boots carried the sound like a heartbeat. I placed my hand down. Cold. Still. Then another knock. Closer. I checked the system console. No movement reported. External sensors all green. No pressurization anomalies. No mechanical tests scheduled. Yet I knew. Something had shifted out there. Not tectonic. Not thermal. Not explainable by machine diagnostics. This was movement with intent. The next morning, my assignment was altered. My name had been moved in the system to the Environmental Diagnostics Unit, a team that hadn't been mentioned during orientation. When I arrived at the unit, I found a room filled with acoustic panels, subsonic recording equipment, and analog waveform displays. Most of it decades old. A technician with a haunted look handed me a stack of reel-to-reel tapes, each labeled only by date. I asked what I was supposed to be listening for. He replied without looking at me. Patterns. I asked what kind. He whispered, "The kind pressure doesn't make." That night, the creaks returned. Then, knocks. Then, impossibly, a dragging sound that traveled the length of the hallway outside my quarters. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. But the condensation on the walls had been smeared. Not a handprint. A trail. As if something large and wet had slid by, pressing against the structure as it moved. I stood there in silence, the lights flickering overhead, the emergency red glow casting long shadows that refused to sit still. And I remembered what the engineer said. It happens sometimes. But pressure doesn't knock. Pressure doesn't drag. Pressure doesn't smear walls with something that glistens even after the lights go out. And the worst part? I hadn't told anyone what I'd heard. Not yet. But that morning, someone had left a note on my desk. It wasn't typed. It wasn't signed. Just 5 words, scribbled in shaky handwriting on facility issue paper. Don't follow the sounds down. On my 3rd day inside the base, the lights began to blink. At first, I thought it was nothing. Perhaps a routine fluctuation in the power grid, the kind of hiccup that comes from massive systems running too long without maintenance. But then I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stiffen. It always happened at the same time. Precisely 03:13 a.m. Facility time. A sharp flicker. On, off, on, pause. Then another sequence. The blink wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, measured, too precise to be electrical decay. I sat up in my bunk, already halfway dressed, because I'd long since given up trying to sleep. The hum of the base, that low, ever-present mechanical thrum of life support systems and oxygen circulators, seemed quieter during those minutes. Not absent, just subdued, as if the base itself were holding its breath. I watched the ceiling, counted the flashes, wrote them down. 7 short bursts. Then a pause, then 5 long, then 3 short. It repeated twice, then stopped completely, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. I brought it up casually to one of the techs during a systems check. A young engineer with the kind of posture you only develop from working too long in small spaces. He looked at me, then at the overhead fixtures, then down at the floor, and finally back at me with a whisper. You've seen it too. He took me to a storage closet marked Maint A04, pretending to check a fuse board, and inside he opened the back panel of a control relay. Hidden behind wires was a tiny notebook, filled margin to margin with sequences of light blinks, all time-stamped, all annotated. We've been logging it for months, he said. Every night, same hour, same interval. Slight variations in order, but it's not random. He flipped through the pages quickly and then handed me a torn sheet. This is the sequence from 2 nights ago. Recognize it? I compared it with my own scribbles. It was identical. It's a code, he said. Has to be. Morse doesn't fit. Neither does binary. But we've mapped it across the entire grid. It runs through the emergency strips, the ceiling panels, even the elevator diagnostics. It's not malfunctioning, it's using the system. We met again later in the unused mess hall wing. No one eats there anymore. The chairs are stacked, lights dimmed permanently, and even the food dispensers have been shut off. It's like that part of the station gave up trying to pretend we were still people. The engineer, whose name I only then learned was Lucas, laid out printouts of the light patterns over a schematic of the base's layout. Watch this, he said, dragging his pen across the sheet. It forms lines, curves, shapes. Every sequence lights up a different sector. If you plot the coordinates based on blink origin, it's drawing something. Not all at once. Slowly. 1 line a night. I stared at the faint geometric shape that was starting to emerge. An irregular looping spiral intersected by jagged spokes. I didn't recognize it, but it felt wrong. Not in the sense of unfamiliarity, but in the way something primal inside you knows to back away before the mind can name what it sees. Lucas explained how the patterns started months ago, but at first only appeared in the observation deck. Then they moved to the research labs, and now into the residential wings. It's spreading, he said, voice dry. It's like it's testing reach, seeing what it can control. Like the base is slowly becoming a canvas. I asked what it wanted. He laughed, a bitter little sound that didn't match the mood. If it wanted to kill us, it would have already. There are 100 ways to breach the hull, overload oxygen processors, lock us in decompression cycles. But it doesn't. It waits. It shows us things. And now it's talking. Or trying to. He looked up at the flickering ceiling and went silent for a moment. Then whispered, "Do you ever feel like we're the experiment?" That night, I stayed in the hallway instead of returning to my bunk. At 03:13, the lights blinked again. Same pattern, same duration. But this time, something else happened. In the stillness after the last flicker, a faint sound played through the comm system. Barely audible. I thought at first it was static, but it was too shaped, too intentional, like whispering. Dry, wet syllables scraping over each other, syllabic but non-linguistic. I walked to the nearest wall speaker and pressed my ear against it. My breath froze. Inside the static, layered beneath the hiss, was the cadence of something not human, but mimicking speech. Like it had listened to how we talk, but didn't understand the words. It was trying, reaching, failing. The speaker hissed louder for a second, then clicked off. When I turned around, someone was standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't Lucas. It wasn't anyone I recognized. No name on the uniform, no badge. They didn't move. Just stood, motionless, silhouetted by the red emergency strip along the floor. I took 1 step forward and the lights blinked once. The figure was gone. I checked the corner, every adjacent room, even the crawlspace access. Nothing. But when I returned to my quarters, there was a note on my bunk, written in the same trembling handwriting as before. 5 new words. Don't stare at the patterns. Lucas didn't show up the next morning. When I went to his quarters, the door was locked. When I asked command, they told me no one by that name was assigned to this wing. I checked the logs. He wasn't there. Not just missing, removed. Like he'd never existed. But his notebook was gone too. Only the printouts remained, left in the mess hall, scattered like discarded blueprints. On the back of one, scribbled in what I recognized as Lucas's frantic penmanship, was a final sequence. Not just lights, numbers, coordinates. A time. 03:13. And the phrase, "It's not just patterns, it's location." That night, I watched the sequence again. I traced the lights across the ceiling with my finger, mouthing the blinks aloud, feeling something inside me trying to map their rhythm onto thought. I couldn't sleep afterward. I sat on the floor, staring at the dark screen, waiting for the next flicker. I didn't even realize I was whispering until I heard myself say it. It's trying to show us where. And then I heard the drag again. Closer this time. Slower. Accompanied by a soft, deliberate knock, 3 times, against the hull. Not from above. Not from the hallway. From outside. 11,000 meters deep. Something had found the base. And now it wanted us to see. The incident with the blinking lights, the missing engineer, and the whispers in the static should have triggered some kind of protocol. But there was no emergency meeting. No lockdown. No mention of Lucas. As if his presence had been a mirage we all collectively imagined and then quietly erased. The base returned to its routine, though the rhythm now felt unnatural, like a song played at the wrong tempo. I began moving through the halls like a ghost, keeping my head low, listening for the sound of footfalls that never matched the bodies I passed. It was around this time I became obsessed with the administrative wing, specifically the locked archive marked Restricted, Proje 809. I'd seen it dozens of times before, always sealed by a biometric scanner. But now the keypad was half disassembled, wires exposed, as if someone had tried to override it and failed. Or succeeded. I waited until shift change, when the hallway cameras blinked off for maintenance, and most of the crew were either asleep or sedated. I had memorized the blind spots by then, knew which vents hummed when the sensors were rebooting, and how long the override circuit stayed vulnerable before resetting. I didn't need to get far, just inside, just long enough to see. The door gave a reluctant hiss and slid half open. Inside was darkness, pierced only by the amber glow of a half-dead monitor at the far wall. Dust floated in the air like underwater particles suspended in zero current, and the smell hit me immediately. Old electronics, rust, and something else. Something like formaldehyde, as if the room itself had been preserved. There were cabinets along the walls, most of them locked. A few had been pried open. I rifled through papers, half-burnt files, reports with redacted text that looked less like censorship and more like someone had panicked mid-erasure. On one page, stamped in the corner, were the words, Project Moray, Phase 2. The title stopped me. Something about it triggered a memory I couldn't place, like a name heard in a dream years ago. The report was brittle and incomplete, but the diagrams were clear. Cross-sections of deep-sea trench structures, biological notations, and something that looked like a schematic of the base itself, except it wasn't our base. It was older, cruder, less refined, with hand-drawn annotations in languages I couldn't read. One page caught my eye. It had only one sentence at the top. Structure discovered. Specimen non-hostile, for now. My fingers trembled as I turned the page, revealing a photograph, faded and scratched, of a submersible window looking out into the black. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, was a shape pressed against the glass. Not a creature. Not quite. Just texture. Like flesh stretched thin, covered in patterns that looked like a face, but not a human one. My stomach turned. The annotations on the back were mostly unreadable, but 2 words remained, underlined in thick ink. Echosymmetry. I didn't understand what it meant until I flipped another page and found a sonar mapping log with overlapping waveforms. The ping data was familiar. It matched the distorted sonar signature from 2 nights ago. The inverted return that made one of our operators collapse in panic. It wasn't just noise. It was repetition, deliberate mimicry. I found more fragments. A note scribbled in haste. They communicate through reversal, form inversion. Sound bent back on itself. We're hearing the shape of what they are, not what they say. Another file described anomalies during early excavation, tools malfunctioning, lights dimming in perfect synchrony with seismic pulses. But it was this phrase, scrawled in red across the final page, that made my breath catch in my throat. Project Moray wasn't to contain them. It was to learn how they think. Behind me, something scraped softly. I turned, heart pounding. But the door remained open. No one was there. I gathered what pages I could, folded them into my uniform, and left the archive. The door closed behind me, with a sound that didn't quite match its usual hiss. It almost sounded like breathing. The next morning, The biologist assigned to Sector C, Dr. Kaminsky, a man who had barely spoken a word to me since I arrived, approached me in the rehydration station. He looked pale, his hands trembling as he stirred his nutrient paste. "Did you see it?" he asked, eyes not meeting mine. "In the archive." I froze. I hadn't told anyone. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied. He shook his head. "Don't lie. I saw your name on the access log. They'll erase you if you keep digging." He looked around the room, leaned closer. "I was here during the initial descent. We weren't supposed to go this deep. The trench, it wasn't empty, it never was. We mapped a cavern before building. They found it, the structure, organic, self-sealing. No tools could break it, but the vibrations, our drilling, woke it up." His voice cracked. "The lights, the sounds, the dreams. It's not just the pressure. It's inside the steel now. It moves through the conduits, through us. You think it's outside trying to get in?" He stared at me for the first time, and I saw a depth of fear I hadn't yet encountered in this place. "You're wrong. It was already here when we arrived." He stood abruptly and dropped his cup. Nutrient paste oozed onto the floor like sludge. Later that day, Kaminsky filed for immediate evacuation. The first in months. The request was denied. That night he was found in his quarters, unresponsive, eyes open, lips moving without sound. Still breathing. But no one could understand what he was mouthing. The psychologist said it was dissociation from pressure trauma. But I recognized the cadence. It matched the lights. I returned to the archive, only to find the keypad fused shut with weld lines across the edges. When I asked about it, I was told the archive had been permanently decommissioned. I checked the internal access logs. There was no record of my entry. Project Moray no longer existed. But in my bunk, tucked beneath my mattress, was a folded page I hadn't seen before. A single word, written in jagged lines, ink pressed too hard. Resonance. Below it, a sketch. Not quite a map. More like a neural web. At the center, a spiral. Around it, symbols. And at the base, the outline of our station. Tiny. Insignificant. Cradled inside a larger shape I hadn't dared imagine until then. Not the ocean. A mouth. And we were already inside. I thought I knew what silence meant in this place. I thought I understood the weight of it. The kind that presses down on your chest even when you're alone. The kind that fills every hallway like heavy water. But I didn't know true silence until the knock came. That's when I realized silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the moment just after something has made a noise it never should have. A sound that rewrites the rules of where you are and what you think is possible. And when it's over, the quiet that follows isn't peace, it's mourning. Because something has changed. Permanently. It happened at 03:17 local time. I remember the exact moment because I was awake, again, reviewing the notes I had hidden inside the lining of my jacket. Half-torn pages from the Project Moray archive, sketches of the sonar echoes, fragments of Kaminsky's rambling. I was trying to piece them together into something coherent, but they weren't pieces of a puzzle. They were teeth, scattered and sharp, each one pointing in a different direction. And then the bass groaned, not the usual creaks of metal under pressure, not the subtle shift of the tides against the outer hull, but a sound that was far more deliberate, measured, 3 knocks, precise, hard, from outside. I froze, pen in hand, breath locked in my throat. The sound hadn't echoed. It had landed, heavy and close. Not like something brushing the station, like something asking. I waited for the alarm, the breach protocol, the blaring sirens that signaled hull compromise. But nothing came. The station's automated systems remained indifferent. The lights stayed dim and red. The oxygen flow unbroken. The sensors reported status green across the board. It was as if nothing had happened. And yet I knew what I had heard. So did everyone else. Within an hour, whispers spread. The crew on shift in command ops were already replaying the audio logs, trying to determine the source. They couldn't agree. Some claimed it came from Sector G. Others said it was from the main storage dome. One technician insisted it was from directly above the observation dome, but that was impossible. That section faced open trench, descending for kilometers below. No drones were scheduled. No submersibles had been dispatched. The logs showed zero movement. And yet, the sound was there. A vibration imprinted into the steel like a fingerprint burned into flesh. Security ordered a lockdown of all external hatches. A full scan of the outer shell was initiated, using drones we hadn't deployed in weeks, recalled from stasis bays coated in dust and frost. The lead engineer, Wallace, took the controls himself. We watched the live feed from the drone's external cam as it began its slow crawl along the hull. Nothing at first, just cold blackness, infinite and crushing. Then, as the drone moved past the lower hatch of Sector D, the lights on the monitor flickered, just for a moment. The feed scrambled and returned. When it stabilized, a mark had appeared. Faint, but visible. A dent. No, not a dent. A depression. The metal wasn't broken, but it had been touched. Compressed inward. And not randomly. The outline was unmistakable. 3 distinct points. As if something with fingers had knocked. Not with a fist. Not with mass or momentum. But gently. Calculated. Enough to make itself known. Wallace shut off the drone and disconnected the stream. Sensor malfunction, he muttered, voice clipped. But his hands trembled. No one believed him. Not really. The senior crew called for a silent meeting. No announcements, no general alert. Only those on active shift were included. I wasn't invited, but I watched through the service duct vent behind the environmental monitoring station. I saw them. 8 officers, sitting in the dim light, faces tight, eyes sunken from exhaustion or something worse. Commander Hayes, who rarely spoke more than necessary, leaned forward. "We don't report this. Not yet. We mark it as tectonic interference, seismic anomaly. Log it and forget it." One of the younger officers objected, asking what protocol said about unknown contacts. Hayes's response chilled me. Protocol doesn't cover what knocks on the hull 11,000 meters below the surface. Protocol assumes we're alone. That night, something changed in the rhythm of the base. People moved slower. No one lingered in corridors alone. Even the ones who didn't hear the knock knew something had happened. The air tasted different. Heavier. I passed by one of the junction rooms and caught sight of Anderson, the comms operator, standing perfectly still in front of the reinforced window, staring out, not blinking. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He flinched like I had shocked him. "Did you hear it again?" I asked. He shook his head, then paused. "No, I didn't hear it," he whispered. "But I felt it. In my teeth." In the days that followed, we kept scanning, kept listening. No more knocks. But motion sensors along the trench perimeter began to trigger at odd intervals. Not movement, presence. Something passing into range, then retreating. Always just at the edge. The algorithms couldn't classify it. Too slow for currents. Too fast for sediment flow. One entry read, "Mass displacement detected. Source, undefined." The timestamp, 03:17. Again. And again, the next day. And the next. On the 4th recurrence, I stayed up to watch it myself. I sat in the old security station outside the sealed archive, alone, watching the raw sensor data scroll across the screen. The hum of the base faded into the background as I watched the depth indicators, the pressure readings, the acoustic profiles. And then it came. The drop. A subtle dip in water density, followed by a distortion in sonar. It wasn't an object. It was absence. As if something vast had passed by but refused to be measured. That same night, I found a note in my locker. Folded, unsigned. The paper was wet, as if it had been dipped in brine. 4 words, handwritten, slanted and frantic. "They know we're here." There was no name. No sign of who had left it. Just the faint outline of fingerprints still damp on the corner. I tried to report it, but my request was rerouted. Deleted. I checked the system logs. No submission recorded. My access had been silently restricted. Then came the whispers. Not from people, from the walls. I began to hear them in the maintenance shafts, in the filtration pipes. Soft, rhythmic tapping, like echoing breath or movement through bone. Always distant, always just out of reach. When I asked others, they pretended not to hear it. One man, Gregson from Hydro Engineering, leaned in close when I pressed him. "We all hear it," he said. "We just don't say it out loud. You say it out loud, it follows you back to your room." I didn't sleep for days. I started keeping logs by hand. Physical paper, pen scratches at odd hours. I drew the 3 knocks over and over, tracing their rhythm like an obsession. I stopped eating, Stopped bathing. The sound echoed inside me now, not just in my memory, in my bones, in the air when no one else was around. Until the day something knocked again. Not 3 times, just once. But this time, from inside the base. There is a sound the ocean makes that no one talks about. It isn't the rumble of pressure or the song of whales or the distant crack of tectonic plates. It's quieter than all of that. It's the echo of something that doesn't want to be found, but still answers when called. We had been running standard diagnostics that morning. Or so we thought. Technically, it wasn't even scheduled. A miscommunication, we were told. But it felt intentional. The orders came directly from Surface Command, with a red priority tag. Deep-range acoustic mapping, it said. Fisher Zone calibration sweep. That was all. The sonar lab was never a place anyone lingered in voluntarily. Even before the knock, it had an atmosphere like a tomb. Low ceilings, no windows, humming monitors in permanent twilight. The sonar display itself was a wide, curved wall of screens, each one showing shifting topographic outlines in pale green. I remember thinking it looked like the inside of a rib cage. Dr. Emmerich oversaw the sweep. He was one of the few here who still seemed to believe the data mattered. He had a long, hollow face, and the kind of eyes that had long since seen past hope. I sat beside him at Console 3, monitoring waveform returns. Our job was simple. Emit a ping, measure the bounce, map the void. The first sweep passed without incident. So did the second. Then, during the third emission, I saw it. A waveform that folded back on itself. Not noise, not interference. A clean, mirrored return. Perfect symmetry. As if the ocean had grown a mirror and held it up to us. Emmerich froze. "That's not possible," he said under his breath. He zoomed in, isolated the echo. The line danced on the screen in complete opposition to the signal we had sent. Not just delayed. Reversed. It was as if the signal had been caught in a loop and thrown back inside out. Then the lights dimmed. Just for a moment. A flicker, like a held breath. Then static burst through the headset feed, forcing both of us to tear them off. Behind the noise, I swear I heard something. Not a voice exactly. A tone. A deep, constant vibration. Not like machinery, but like something alive humming just beneath the threshold of human hearing. I turned to Emmerich. He was pale, sweating, unmoving. His mouth hung slightly open. His pupils had dilated. When I spoke his name, he didn't respond. He didn't blink. His hands had clamped onto the console so tightly his knuckles were white. I shouted. Nothing. Then, slowly, his eyes shifted toward me. It turned it inside out. He whispered. "It's not reflecting. It's speaking." Medical had to sedate him. Later, I overheard someone say he had suffered a psychotic break. His records were locked. The next morning, his name was gone from the logbook, replaced with substitute technician assigned. But I knew what we had seen. I pulled the echo data from the local archive, copied it to my private drive. I analyzed the return pattern over and over. The signal wasn't just inverted. It was modulated, shifted, structured. There were gaps between bursts, intentional pauses, like syllables, like language. I made the mistake of showing it to Anderson, the comms officer. He studied it silently, then leaned back and lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "You ever hear the phrase acoustic encryption?" he asked. I hadn't. Some classified systems use non-repeating sound patterns to encode messages. The spacing, the waveform curve. This isn't just a bounce back, it's a message. But we don't have the cipher. What if it doesn't need one? I asked. What if it's not meant to be decoded, just understood? He didn't answer. He just stared at the waveform and shook his head. The days blurred. Everyone moved differently. Paranoia thickened like algae in a tank. Crew members started wearing earplugs when off shift. I passed a woman in the corridor, Diaz, from life support, and she was crying silently. When I asked what was wrong, she looked up at me like I had spoken in a foreign tongue. "It's in the walls," she said. "It listens when we sleep." Then the anomalies began. Storage inventory went missing. Whole crates, supposedly never delivered. Equipment tagged as already returned was still in use. One drone unit launched itself without command and was found circling the trench edge, signal jammed and silent. The technician responsible swore he hadn't touched the controls. He was reassigned. I began to notice that some people had stopped using the main corridors. They used maintenance shafts, Old elevator ladders, back routes, as if the open hallways were being watched. I joined them. It felt safer in the narrow dark. One night, I found a section of pipe in an unused shaft vibrating softly. I pressed my ear to it, and I heard the echo, the same inside-out signal, but this time, layered with something else, a second tone, lower, like it was breathing. I recorded what I could. When I tried to play it back on my tablet, the audio wouldn't render. It just showed a black screen. Then, briefly, a single phrase appeared on the interface, something I never typed, in a font I didn't recognize. "We remember you." The screen went blank. The tablet shut down. It never turned on again. By then, sleep had become impossible. The air felt heavier each day. The base, once clinical and cold, began to feel alive, like a creature adapting to our presence. The walls dripped more than usual. The lights lingered longer after being shut off. Sometimes I'd pass a dark room and feel like someone had just left it, or hadn't left yet. Dr. Emmerich was never seen again. One technician claimed he saw him through the observation dome, standing on the trench floor, 30 meters from the hull. No suit, no gear, just his silhouette, still and staring. But when they reviewed the footage, there was nothing there. Just the faint flicker of reversed sonar lines, pulsing gently against the dark. They called it a hallucination. I didn't believe them, because that night, I heard the echo again, clearer than ever. But this time, it wasn't from the outside. It was inside the base, calling back. The incident began with a hiss, not the usual mechanical exhalation of pressurized doors or venting pipes, but a sharp, irregular pulse like the release of a dying breath. It came from the far eastern quadrant, Sector H4, the hydraulic pressure corridor, where redundant valve systems helped keep the facility stabilized against the unimaginable weight of 11 kilometers of water above us. For a moment, no one paid attention. These sounds happened often. The base groaned like a living thing now, its bones forever adjusting to some unseen force. But then the pressure monitors started to flicker. Red, amber, green, red again, then flatline. We were told it was minor, a routine inspection, nothing structural. But command's tone was off. The request came too fast, too rehearsed. They wanted a diver sent out immediately, just one. No team, no external drones, no pre-scan of the corridor's exterior valve junctions. Just a solo extravehicular mission, to verify integrity. His name was Crowell. He'd been here longer than most of us. Quiet, patient, methodical. He never asked questions. He never refused orders. When they gave him the assignment, he didn't hesitate. He nodded once, muttered something about clearing a few icicles, and began to suit up. I stood in the prep room while they sealed his exosuit. It was one of the deep core variants, reinforced with carbon plating and equipped with short-range uplink. As the helmet sealed shut, I thought I saw something strange flicker in his eyes. Not fear, but detachment. A kind of resignation. "Comms live," he confirmed. "Suit pressure nominal, external cams, green." I watched from the observation dome as the outer airlock cycled. The pressure equalized, slowly swallowing the chamber in total darkness before the outer hatch opened. Then he stepped out, into that abyss, into nothing. The corridor he was heading toward lay beyond the auxiliary strut, just over a dozen meters from the hull. A familiar route. Well lit. Mapped. His voice crackled over the headset. Crossing midline. Visibility good. Current negligible. No foreign debris in the path. But something felt wrong immediately. On screen, his camera feed was flickering. Not erratically, but rhythmically. 1 second of static. 2 seconds clear. Repeat. Repeat. And with each static pulse, I could swear something shifted in the ambient light, like a shadow adjusting itself out of view. Crowell's tone changed about 12 meters out, getting some distortion in audio, like a hum. Low frequency, subsonic, maybe a leak in the pressure plate. I leaned closer to the monitor. "What do you see?" A pause. Too long. "Just the corridor. Valve housing looks intact from here. I'm going in for a closer." The camera cut. No static, no warning. Just darkness. "Crowell, respond," I said. "Comms check. Video feed interrupted. Please confirm status." Nothing. The screen stayed black. Then, without warning, the video feed returned. Only for 3 seconds. It was enough. The camera was angled low, tilted slightly upward, as if the helmet were being held loosely in someone's hand. Crowell's face was in frame. His visor was up. His eyes were wide, but not panicked. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't moving at all. He stood completely still, gazing past the lens, toward something off-camera, something the feed never revealed. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his gloved hand and reached for the chest panel of the suit, and turned off the feed. The screen went black for good. I can't describe the silence that followed. It wasn't shock. It wasn't dread. It was certainty. The quiet of something inevitable. They sent out a second team 15 minutes later. Full gear. 2 drones. Full sensor sweep. They found nothing. No suit. No body. No trail. The entire corridor was dry. No breach. No evidence of mechanical failure. The logs listed unknown cause, presumed decompression trauma. But no depressurization was detected. No system alarms had triggered. And yet Crowell was gone. I asked to review the footage again. Command denied the request. Compromised data integrity, they said. But I'd already copied the 3 seconds of recovered feed to a private drive. I watched it 100 times that night, frame by frame. On the 19th frame, just before he raises his hand, a faint reflection appears in the visor's curve. A distortion. A ripple. Like the helmet is bending light in a way it shouldn't. A shape, maybe. A silhouette. But there's no source for the reflection. No light. No object. No presence. And yet it's there. Clear as a fingerprint in condensation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his expression. Not terror, not surprise, but awe. As if he was seeing something that had always been there. Something waiting. Something so ancient and so vast that the human mind, when confronted with it, simply gave up. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the base changed. No one said his name. His room was cleared, his possessions boxed. But I noticed something on the wall above his bunk. A series of tally marks scratched into the metal paneling. 7 short lines, 1 long diagonal, then 4 more beneath it. 11 total. He hadn't made any since the week before he vanished. I wondered if they meant days, or something else. Later, I tried to access his maintenance logs. They were gone. Not locked, erased, scrubbed from the system. His ID card no longer triggered the door sensors, as if he'd never existed. And yet, late one night, as I passed the junction to his wing, I heard something, barely audible through the metal. A knock, then another, then silence, just like before. Only this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the ventilation shaft behind his room. Crowell never returned, but something else did. After Crowell vanished, something in the air shifted. Not metaphorically, though that too, but literally. The base's environmental systems, which had once emitted the soft white noise of artificial normalcy, now hummed with a nervous pulse. The atmospheric levels were pristine, as always. The logs showed 21% oxygen, steady CO2, 0 foreign particles, humidity, and pressure within optimal ranges. But breathing became effortful. Not like drowning or gasping. More like breathing beside something that shouldn't be breathing with you. Something that pressed in from the periphery of your perception. Not loud, but undeniably present. It began slowly, like a suggestion your body picked up before your mind did. At first, I thought it was stress, psychosomatic reactions from isolation, cabin pressure, or the silent grief we weren't allowed to name. Crowell's absence was never addressed. No announcement, no memorial. His name was simply removed from the rosters. His room sealed. His voice, once monotone and procedural in the briefings, gone, like a sound your ears forget how to recognize. But our bodies remembered. Mine most of all. I began waking up in the middle of the night, heart hammering against my ribs like it had been sprinting in my sleep. My skin would be slick with sweat, but the room was cold. Too cold. The ventilation shaft above my bunk rattled with the occasional tick of metal expanding or contracting, but sometimes I could swear I heard breath coming through it. Not the cycling of filtered air, not the mechanical hiss of climate control. Actual breath. Wet, measured, as if something on the other side were breathing in perfect sync with mine. I checked the environmental sensors daily. Every readout returned normal. No contaminants, no pressure leaks, no radiation spikes. Yet others had begun to report similar symptoms. Simmons, the chief systems engineer, started wearing a portable rebreather, claiming the air smelled wrong. He said it reminded him of old diving suits, rubber, salt, and something sour beneath the mask. Deka from comms collapsed during her shift and had to be restrained after insisting the walls were pulsing. She said she could hear a second heartbeat echoing through the floor grates, matching her own until it stuttered and skipped ahead, trying to get in sync. The medbay found nothing. No pathogens, no abnormalities. They gave her a sedative and told her to rest. But no one was resting. Sleep became fractured. We walked the halls like ghosts, our eyes sunken, our muscles tense, our breath shallow and rapid. Some of us wore masks. Others turned off their lights at night, saying the shadows were less active when it was dark. I stopped entering the observation dome completely. I couldn't bring myself to look out anymore. Not after what I thought I saw on my last shift. A shimmer, just at the edge of the viewing glass, like a hand pressed lightly against the other side of the pressure dome, except there was nothing there when I turned. On the 5th day after Crowell's disappearance, I woke gasping. My throat was raw, my chest tight. The room felt like it had been vacuum sealed. I rushed to the panel and checked the air. Normal. Still normal. Always normal. And yet, I was suffocating. I stumbled into the corridor and collapsed just outside medbay. It took a full minute of forced breathing before my lungs caught up to me, like a runner lagging behind their own body. The attending physician scanned me and found no issues. In fact, my vitals were excellent. He asked me if I was experiencing anxiety. I almost laughed. Not because I wasn't, but because anxiety felt like such a small word. Like calling the crushing of a submarine hull a mild inconvenience. I told him no, I just hadn't been sleeping well. He nodded as if that were enough. Maybe for him it was. Later that day, while reviewing life support data in Control Room B, I found something buried in the raw telemetry logs. Microsecond anomalies in the oxygen balance. Not in quantity. In rhythm. There were fluctuations that didn't match any known mechanical cycle. Every 74 minutes there was a localized dip in oxygen content in a specific sector, Sector C3, followed by a slight temperature drop, then a return to baseline. It was as if something were exhaling, a respiration cycle, but nothing human, and nothing accounted for by the station's systems. I ran the patterns against the schedule of personnel movements. None matched. The dips occurred when the sector was empty, or at least when it should have been. I submitted a report to command. It was marked received. I never heard back. That night I recorded myself sleeping. I set up a thermal sensor as well, just to quiet my own mind. I told myself I'd find nothing. Some restless tossing, maybe. Ambient heat from the ventilation ductwork. The usual noise of the deep. But when I reviewed the footage the next morning, my mouth went dry. Around 03:14, I shifted in my bunk, breathing heavily. My pulse, measured by the sleep tracker, spiked to 148 BPM. Then, for 11 seconds, I stopped breathing altogether. The oxygen levels in the room held steady. But the thermal sensor registered a presence, a cold shape, like a silhouette, moving from the corner of the room to the edge of my bed. It remained there for 5 full minutes. My body did not move. I remained unconscious. When I awoke, I remembered nothing. But I felt it, that presence, watching, breathing beside me. They say hallucinations are common in deep-sea environments. Sensory deprivation, prolonged darkness, isolation. But this wasn't a hallucination. It left a trace. Not just in data, but in the body. I began to tremble during the day. My fingertips tingled like the skin remembered being touched. I could no longer tell if I was breathing too fast, or if my body was trying to match something else's rhythm. Something ancient. Something patient. Others started whispering about shifts in pressure without any alarms. Doors creaking slightly ajar, even when sealed. One man claimed he saw someone walking down the hall toward him, only to realize no footsteps accompanied the figure, and then it vanished before his eyes. They gave him sedatives. He refused to sleep. I began walking the halls late at night, hoping to catch the pattern in motion. Not because I wanted to see it, but because I needed to confirm it was real. That I wasn't just unraveling, That's when I found the scratch marks. On the back wall of the unused storage bay near Sector C3. Deep enough to dent the metal. Not letters, not numbers, just hash marks. Dozens of them. No one claimed responsibility. No one acknowledged they were there. But they hadn't been there a week ago. Something was counting. Something was breathing with us. Something had adjusted to our rhythms, and it was getting closer. There comes a moment in places like this, sealed off from the world, buried under pressure that could crush bone into powder, when the glass no longer feels like a barrier, but a membrane, thin, breathing, permeable. We were told the observation dome was triple reinforced, pressure-rated, one of the safest parts of the base. They built it so we could feel connected to the environment, as if staring into 10,000 meters of black water would comfort anyone slowly unraveling at the seams. I hadn't entered that room in over a week, not since the hallucinations started, not since the sensation of being watched became a weight I couldn't shake from my shoulders. But that night, something pulled me there. I didn't plan it. I didn't think. My feet simply moved, almost like sleepwalking, past the dimmed corridor lights and through the decontamination vestibule. The sensor door opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting. The dome was silent, lit only by the dull emergency luminance, just enough to illuminate the room without drawing attention from the outside. As if that mattered. As if darkness could hide us from what was already aware. I stood in the center of the dome, facing the curved glass. Outside, nothing but darkness. Not even the dull bloom of bioluminescence that sometimes passed like ghostly ribbons. Just the deep, the unlit, the unfathomable. And yet, my breath caught. My lungs tensed again, but not from the air. I felt the return of that sensation. The compression of presence, like the density of another awareness just behind me. My neck prickled. My ears strained for sound. The soft hum of the bass, the occasional creak of metal, and then nothing. Absolute stillness. Then the lights blinked. Just once. A stutter. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a movement. It wasn't a flash. It was the absence of everything. A shape so dark it redefined the shadows around it. I didn't know how long it had been there, pressed against the outside of the dome. Large, motionless, irregular in outline. Almost like the folded limbs of something waiting to unfurl. There were no features, no eyes. But I knew in the deepest, most ancestral part of myself, that it was looking in, looking at me. Not just my body, but my thoughts, my memories, peeling me back layer by layer like the skin of an onion. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't, couldn't. My limbs were locked, not by fear, though it throbbed in my chest, but by something else. A pressure from the other side of the glass, not physical, but psychological. As if it were willing me to stay, to witness, to understand something I wasn't supposed to. I stared. It didn't move. Not forward. Not away. It just existed. A presence that seemed both impossibly large and intimate at once. I broke the trance when a static crackled through the room's internal comms. Just a flicker of sound, distorted and low, like a tape winding backward. Then silence again. When I looked back, the shape was gone. Not dissolved or faded. Just gone. Like it had never been there. The glass bore no fog, no mark, no trace. But the imprint it left in my mind remained. A silhouette carved into the inside of my eyelids. I ran a scan. Thermal sensors, exterior proximity, sonar. Nothing. Clean. No anomalies detected. I played back the last 2 hours of surveillance footage from the dome. All it showed was me. Standing there, alone. No blink of light. No flicker of shadow. No shape. No proof. But I remembered the cold. I remembered the paralysis. I remembered the absence. The logs would call it a hallucination. A psychotic break under pressure. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. Others began whispering. Theories born from insomnia and paranoia, but spoken in tones too serious to dismiss as delusion. They said something had followed the diver back. If not physically, then residually. Like static clinging to cloth. That whatever we'd disturbed down there, whatever Moray had prodded and measured and catalogued, was awake now, and curious. 2 days later, during a shift change, Varga, station security, stood her post in the dome. She wasn't one to rattle. She'd served 3 tours on Arctic subs, and once euthanized a mad dog in an airlock when it attacked a crewmate. Tough, precise, no nonsense. But that morning, when her replacement came to relieve her, she was gone. The door to the dome was locked from the inside. It took override access to open. When they got in, the place was empty. No signs of struggle, no damage. Just her clipboard, her flashlight, and her boots. The boots were pointed toward the glass. We combed the base. Every crevice. Every corridor. She wasn't there. No logs of movement. No opening of emergency exits. The exterior drones showed nothing. One of the younger techs suggested she'd left through the observation hatch. He was laughed out of the room. There is no observation hatch. It's 11,000 meters of solid pressure. You don't open the dome. Not unless you want the ocean to drink the entire room in milliseconds. But someone asked, quietly, what if something opened it from the outside? Not physically, but conceptually. What if whatever was looking in had found a way to reach through? Not with arms or appendages, but with presence, with influence. What if Varga had simply answered a call? Command denied all incident reports. Her disappearance was flagged as medical evacuation due to pre-existing condition. No flight logs supported this. Her personal locker was emptied. Her name, redacted. I still had her last message saved, a joke about coffee rations running low. It hurt to hear her voice again. So normal, so unaware, as if we hadn't all been breathing wrong for days. I began noticing things in reflections after that. Not in mirrors. They were rare down here. But in polished surfaces. Screens, panels, even puddles of water from condensation leaks. Flickers. Shifts in light that didn't match the motion of my own body. Shapes that moved when I stayed still. Eyes. Brief, angular impressions of them, where there should have been none. Watching. Always watching. Not aggressive, not yet. Just present. Waiting. I stopped trusting the glass after that. Not just in the dome, in the corridors, in the specimen tanks, in the face shields of my crewmates. I could feel it. The sense that somewhere, on the other side, something watched us not with curiosity, but with intention. Studying. Calculating. Becoming familiar. And with each passing hour, the glass seemed thinner. There are doors in this base that no one is meant to open. Not because they're locked behind security clearance or hidden beneath bureaucratic layers of protocol, but because they mark the limits of what we can accept as real. The soft barrier between the explainable and the quietly horrific. One such door was in Sector 3, deep within the oldest part of the station. Originally meant for emergency overflow and containment tests. Long since abandoned, sealed, and marked with a pale red stripe that no one talked about. We were told it led to an auxiliary ballast chamber used for pressure equalization during the original descent modules, but that it had been rendered obsolete after retrofits. No one went near it. Until the morning after, the power flickered in patterns again. Only this time, the sequence was inverted. Left, right, left, left, right. Like a code someone had forgotten how to translate, or a memory trying to rewrite itself. I woke up with my lungs aching, not from lack of oxygen but from something tighter, more abstract. Like the pressure wasn't around me anymore but inside me, folding the ribs inward. When I finally stumbled out of my bunk, a low-level alert was sounding, barely a whisper above the station's usual mechanical hum. The screens flashed pale yellow, anomaly detected, fluid breach, Sector 3. At first I thought it was a sensor fault. We hadn't used Sector 3 in years. The engineers didn't even list it in the weekly rotation reports. But someone had tagged the maintenance team, and for some reason, I followed them. Not out of duty. Out of instinct. Like I was being pulled. When we reached the corridor, the air was strangely dry. No vapor, no condensation, just stillness. The temperature was wrong. Colder than it should have been. I noticed Dr. Nyambe shivering and hugging her coat tighter, but she said nothing. We rounded the corner toward the old containment hallway, where the red-striped bulkhead sat like a forgotten scar in the wall. And that's when we saw the water. A thin, silent sheen of it, spreading out across the floor, seeping from under the door, not gushing, not roaring, just present. The door itself was ajar, just enough to suggest a human hand, a decision. But the logs told a different story. Security footage from the hour before showed no one entering the corridor. The lights were dim, untouched. Then, at 03:23:41, the door shuddered once, twice, then slid open in a single smooth motion. A pulse of water emerged, like exhalation, but nothing exited. No shadow, no object, no human form, just water. The footage looped again and again, and each time we watched it, the sense of wrongness deepened. It wasn't what happened. It was what didn't happen. The door didn't register as unlocked. The internal sensors didn't trip. The system believed it had never been opened. And yet, there it was, cracked and bleeding seawater. Cardenas volunteered to approach it first, his voice too steady to be real. He moved with careful steps, one gloved hand extended like a blind man testing the air for walls that weren't there. When he reached the doorframe, he paused, looked at us, then slowly leaned in. I remember the sound that followed, not from the chamber, but from him. A kind of whimper, low and confused, the sound of someone seeing something they don't want to understand. He stepped back, said nothing, just shook his head once. Nyambe asked what he saw. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to me and whispered, "The room's dry." We checked the readings again. External pressure was stable. No breaches in the outer hull. And yet, the room beyond the emergency door, which had clearly flooded at some point, was now empty. No water. No traces of salt on the floor or metal corrosion. Just empty benches, scattered tools, and a long hairline crack running across the far wall, as if something had pushed from inside. But water doesn't leave clean cracks like that. It crushes, folds, implodes. This was a deliberate fracture, made not by pressure, but by something trying to make space, to pass through. Later, when I was alone, I replayed the footage again, focusing not on the door, but the hallway leading up to it. On frame 2371, just for a split second before the door opens, there's a reflection, barely visible, in a puddle near the floor. It's not a person, not an engineer. Something longer, distorted. Its outline pulses, not in rhythm with the camera or the lighting, but with something deeper. A biological rhythm. Something alive. But it disappears before the door opens. Or maybe it entered the door. Or maybe it never needed to. I brought this to Supervisor Archer. His face drained of color as he watched the clip. He told me to delete the local cache, said he'd escalate it through encrypted channels. But 2 hours later, when I tried to follow up, I was told Archer had been reassigned to the medical bay for psychological fatigue. No one else remembered seeing the footage. When I pulled the feed again, it was gone. Not corrupted, not deleted. Replaced. Rewritten with an older maintenance log from 3 months prior. A hallway inspection. Clean. Nothing out of place. After that, I started watching the emergency doors at night. All of them. There are 12 throughout the station, each with redundant locks, manual override systems, and internal oxygen suppression. No one is supposed to access them without authorization from command. But one by one they began to drift. I'd walk by and see a handle not quite centered. A light blinking the wrong color. A smudge on the floor that wasn't there before. It felt like the base was opening itself, section by section, like lungs inflating in reverse. Something drawing in. Not air, not pressure. Space. Nyambe stopped showing up for briefings. Cardenas started whispering numbers into his wrist when he thought no one was watching. I found Archer's data pad tucked into the frame of my bunk, wrapped in medical gauze. Inside was a single note, written in haste, with a shaking hand. They don't enter through doors. They enter through absence. I don't know what that means yet, but I keep hearing dripping sounds from walls that are dry. I keep smelling salt in rooms sealed for years, and I think, God help me, I think one of the doors inside my own mind is starting to open too. It began with a name I couldn't place, a smear of ink on a checklist, half erased and faded, sitting at the edge of my station's terminal, a maintenance roster for hydraulic recalibration in Sector 5B. Nothing unusual, just initials, followed by task codes and timestamps. But nestled between H. Cardenas and L. Nyambe was a line that triggered something in the back of my mind. R. Halberg, verify coolant intake sink. The name was familiar, in the same way a dream is familiar right before it dissolves. I couldn't picture the face, but I knew the cadence of the name, the shape of it. It wasn't just data. It was memory. I'd spoken to him. I'd had coffee with him at the auxiliary mess. I was certain of it. But when I asked Cardenas about Hallberg, he frowned. Who? He asked without irony. I showed him the file. He blinked. This isn't real, he said flatly. There's no Hallberg assigned to this station. I tried again with Nyambe, then with 2 of the sonar crew. None remembered him. Worse, none even recognized the possibility of the name. No blank expressions or hesitant pauses. Just immediate dismissal, like I'd suggested someone named after a chemical formula. But I remembered the voice. Low, careful. I remembered a conversation about his fear of the observation dome, and how he hated eating after 2100 hours because the lights flickered and made the utensils hum. He'd joked about the sea listening through the glass. I remembered that. I remember laughing. So I searched. I pulled maintenance logs, dive manifests, oxygen logs. Nothing. R. Hallberg didn't exist in the current rotation, nor in the previous quarter, nor in the archived logs. But his handwriting kept surfacing. Margins scribbled on worn manuals. Little notes like, seal this tighter next time, it breathes when you're not looking. And don't trust the second indicator. It shows what it wants to be, not what it is. That last one was inked into the underside of a control panel I opened during a coolant reroute. I recognized the slant of the letters. It matched a checklist I'd signed with him during a pressure valve test 6 weeks ago. But there was no record of that test, and no one on my shift recalled it happening. I dug deeper, knowing full well that I was crossing into territory that had swallowed stronger minds than mine. I accessed the raw maintenance cache, a repository that logs all edits made to technical files, including deletions. It's a slow process. The system is old, segmented by sector and date, requiring layer after layer of validation codes. But deep in the compiled logs of Sector 2's backups, I found a revision made 39 days ago. The edit note read, "Remove R. Hallberg, compliance." The operation was signed off by someone named D. Archer, a supervisor who, as far as the current roster was concerned, had never existed either. I sat for hours staring at that single line of erasure. Remove R. Hallberg, compliance. The file had been sealed under high-level command encryption, but there was no trail of the actual removal, just the directive. No reason, no context, only the bureaucratic language of elimination. That's when I started to suspect that this wasn't about forgetting, it was about unremembering. A deliberate cutting away of a person's presence, not just from files, but from thought, from communal memory. As if remembering Hallberg was the first mistake. As if saying his name anchored something in place. I began finding more of his writing in places that shouldn't have been accessible to him. A systems diagram inside the desalination hub had annotations in the same sharp, sloping script. A scratched message in the maintenance lock. Don't look through the glass after shift change. It reflects too much. And once, pinned to the back of my own clipboard, beneath my daily briefing sheet, a folded corner of lined paper with a single phrase written in a trembling hand. If I vanish, promise me you won't let it be clean. The hallucinations, or what I prayed were hallucinations, started soon after. At night, as I drifted between restless pockets of half-sleep, I would see a man standing in the corner of the dorm module, not facing me, not moving, just standing, still as the shadows he came from. His form shimmered slightly, like heat waves on a frozen mirror, and though I never saw his face, I knew it was Hallberg, and I knew he was waiting, watching to see if I would join him in silence, if I'd allow my own name to slip from the tongues of others until I, too, unraveled into static. I tested my own presence, desperate, asked people if they remembered my arrival date, my bunk assignment, the first time I spoke in briefing. Most did. Some paused. One, a new tech assistant named Lorne, squinted and said, "Weren't you the guy who got reassigned from the Arcadia facility?" I've never been to Arcadia. I've never heard of Arcadia. But when I checked my record, my previous assignment was listed as Arcadia C node, decommissioned. I read the entry 10 times, heart pounding, unable to remember if it had always said that. The font was different, slightly smaller. The metadata showed the last edit as unknown origin. What does it mean to be remembered in a place like this? In a station where identity is tied to swipe cards, oxygen rations, and log entries? If those are erased, does your body still count? Is your breath still yours? Or do you become one more whisper between the metal seams? One more figure standing at the edge of flickering lights that nobody can quite see. There are 12 names listed on the crew manifest pinned to the wall outside the command deck. Yesterday there were 13. I don't remember which one is missing. And that terrifies me more than forgetting Hallberg. Because now, I'm afraid the subtraction is moving faster. I'm afraid I'll look one day and see only 11, then 10, then silence. But Hallberg hasn't vanished completely. He's still here, in the edges of things. In the flicker of monitors when no one is typing. In the slight pause the AI takes when it says our names in sequence. There's always a skip before mine. A hesitation. As if the system is checking whether I should still exist, whether it should bother saying me aloud. So I've started writing this, not as a log, not as a confession, but as an anchor. If you find this, and you remember reading it, then I was real. I was here. I knew R. Hallberg. He mattered. I matter. And if one day your name begins to slip from the tongues of others, I hope someone writes you back into the walls, before the silence does. We'd long believed we had touched the bottom, that the base was anchored to the final rung of the ocean's descent, nestled in the deepest known crevice, where pressure transcended engineering and entered theology. But we were wrong. The revelation came not as a discovery, but as an anomaly. A tremor so low in frequency, it bypassed all traditional seismic sensors, picked up instead by one of the bioacoustic monitors meant to track migrating fauna. At first, the readings were dismissed. Faulty input, electromagnetic interference, a whale song distorted by current or depth. But then it repeated, not once or twice, but cyclically, always at 4:17 UTC, as if the Earth itself was trying to whisper a truth back up to us. The sound wasn't explosive. It wasn't a quake. It was continuous. A subharmonic murmur, vast and trembling, that seemed to pulse through the base structure like blood through bone. We tried isolating the source, triangulating vectors. What we found made our teeth clench and stomachs churn. Beneath the mapped trench, a darkness we had declared final, there was another depth. A chasm within the chasm. A fracture that shouldn't exist, invisible to sonar sweeps and topographical reconstructions. Not a slope, not a depression, a mouth. The term was metaphorical at first, a way to describe the impossible topology. But over time, as the sound deepened and evolved, as it began to vibrate through our boots and fingertips, it became difficult to separate metaphor from fact. The frequency was too precise, too patterned, as if it were being modulated, engineered. One of the linguistics consultants, a man assigned months ago to help analyze potential communications from deep-sea lifeforms, had a breakdown during the third consecutive day of spectral analysis. He ripped his headset off and screamed, "It's not natural resonance, it's a vowel," before collapsing in spasms. He's been sedated ever since, locked in medbay under the name of non-critical neurological fatigue, though everyone knows he hasn't spoken since. That's when they sent us the hydrophone array, a compact vertical stack of high-sensitivity microphones capable of detecting tonal structures from beyond normal biological ranges. We drilled deeper into the bedrock, threading the cable down into the crust, beneath the floor of the base, as far as the rig would allow. The moment the final node activated, every light in the lower decks flickered. Some of them never came back. The sound that came through was not just low. It was alive, undulating, layered, as if it were made from multiple sources breathing in unison. You couldn't hear it as much as feel it, like something pushing the air out of the room while still leaving your lungs full. It bypassed the ears entirely, and nested somewhere behind the eyes, at the base of the skull. After 3 hours, the AI that managed spectrograph translation stopped logging data. The interface simply froze. A soft message blinked once, and then vanished from the screen. Language format: unrecognized. Translation: aborted. I stood by the console and listened, and though no one else would say it out loud, I know they heard what I heard. There was shape in the sound. It curved and bent like syllables, pulsed in intervals too deliberate to be geologic, and there was sorrow in it. Not emotion as we understand it, but a kind of weight, as though the sound was being dragged upward against its will, forced through strata not meant to transmit feeling. I found myself blinking involuntarily, eyes watering without cause, vision doubling as if my brain had tried to invert itself under the pressure of comprehension. It wasn't a message, not in the human sense. It was more like a pressure event made from meaning, a conceptual tremor, carved into tone. We tried isolating the signal, filtering it. One technician even tried mapping it onto a 3D spectrogram, hoping to visualize the source. What she created looked like an opening, a radial spiral that coiled inward, with ridges too uniform to be random. We stared at the image in silence for what felt like hours. It was too symmetrical, too precise. The kind of structure that implies intention, that implies design. When she inverted the waveform and ran it through a sonar pulse loop, the base itself reacted. The walls hummed, not like they were vibrating from outside stimulus, but like they were answering. The lights in the observation wing dimmed simultaneously. The water filtration pumps ceased momentarily, then rebooted in a new cycle without manual override. And one of the long-range comm towers that hadn't responded in weeks came online for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough to transmit an indecipherable burst of data we haven't been able to unpack. That night, I couldn't sleep. None of us could. Even those on sedatives or melatonin regimens lay wide-eyed in their bunks, blinking in unison like something in our bodies had lost the capacity to shut down. When I finally did sleep, I dreamt I was falling, not through water, but through something thicker, heavier, a kind of liquid thought. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There were shapes beside me, drifting parallel to my descent. Shapes with no limbs and too many eyes. I didn't panic. I recognized them. And they, me. One of them turned toward me in the dark and opened a kind of mouth. Not a speaking mouth, but something older, deeper. And from it came the same subharmonic murmur we'd recorded earlier. I woke up with my nose bleeding and found scratches on my arms I couldn't explain. Since then, the sound has continued. It pulses every day, always at 0417. Always the same tone, always from beneath us. We've taken to calling it the breathing. It's easier that way. It's a word that doesn't beg for truth, but I know what it is. I know we are not anchored at the bottom. We are suspended above something that has waited longer than any tectonic cycle, longer than the species that mapped these waters. It is older than pressure, older than the concept of silence, and it has begun to speak, not to us, but through us. Yesterday, I found one of the linguistics team sitting in the comms bay alone, whispering into a dead headset. I stepped closer, trying to hear what she was saying. Her voice was hoarse, raw from repetition. She was repeating the same phrase over and over. Not in English, not in any language I could name. But I recognized the pattern. The breathing had taught her something, and now it was coming through her lips. I backed away. I don't want to know what the next phase is. I don't want to learn the grammar of something that breathes from beneath the world. But the sound grows clearer each day. The pressure isn't killing us. It's tuning us. At first, we assumed it was solar interference. A delay. A brief silence from above. We were used to the lag. 32 seconds, sometimes 40 depending on the data packet. But on the morning of the 13th day, when Dr. Rahman tried to upload the sonar anomalies to the surface servers, the uplink returned null. No handshake, no error code. Just nothing. As if the endpoint had evaporated. The bandwidth lights blinked with feeble hope, pulsing like dying fireflies. We tried again, and again. By the 5th attempt, we had routed through 3 separate subchannels, bypassed every firewall, and even hard-linked the encrypted uplink through the emergency beacon array. Still silence. No acknowledgement. It was then that the technician, Piers, I think, though names have become strangely porous down here, remarked that it wasn't just that command wasn't responding. It was as if the address itself had been erased. Not jammed. Forgotten. When we checked the static directory of uplinks stored on the comms AI, we discovered that the terminal label Surface Command Pry had been replaced with a blank field. Not corrupted, not glitched. Just missing. The base reacted with eerie neutrality. No alarms, no fallback. The system treated the change as intentional, as if it had been told to forget. That's when Dr. Flores suggested we listen closer to the white noise from the dish array. He'd always had a theory that buried within the static there were patterns, pulses too low for conscious interpretation, like hidden messages under a bed of snow. We isolated the last full-frequency echo received from the surface 4 days prior, and ran it through a vocoder, a wave-splitting algorithm, a suite of language decoders. At first, it was just static, but then the noise shifted, ever so slightly, into something that made my jaw lock. It wasn't words, not in the sense we knew them, but there was a cadence, A mouth behind the sound, almost like a language trying to imitate itself, sibilant and wet and recursive. It came in bursts, punctuated by silence, almost rhythmic. One of the linguists burst out laughing. She said it was trying to breathe between syllables, like it wasn't made to speak, but was forcing itself through our auditory systems anyway. Then she stopped laughing. Her eyes went glassy and she whispered, "I think it's naming things. I think it's trying to give names to us." The audio logs are riddled now. Each time we record the static, a new layer seems to crawl underneath the last, a kind of deepening. There's no clear signal from the surface, no GPS updates, no orbital sync. The Earth might as well have cracked open and swallowed the relay satellites whole. And yet, paradoxically, we're still receiving something. A vibration, a set of pulses, but they're not originating above. They're rising through the bedrock, carried not by electromagnetic force but by contact. Sub-basal conduction, the rock itself is transmitting. Command isn't responding because command is no longer above us. Yesterday, one of the engineers found something even more disturbing. He accessed the metadata of our outgoing distress signals, the automatic ones pinged every 6 hours by default, and discovered that none of them had left the system. Not one. The system logs marked each one as sent, with time and signature. But the packet traces revealed that all transmissions had been intercepted locally, as in, here, within the base, as if a ghost server had been embedded inside our architecture, rerouting everything into itself. A false uplink, a mimic. When we tried to trace its origin, the base interface rebooted. No prompt, no warning, just a blank screen, followed by the standard logo and boot sequence. But the voice that greeted us on restart, our base AI, Stella, was wrong. Not just in tone, but in cadence. She said, "Operational integrity confirmed. Echo complete. Speak again." No one had spoken. Since then, lights have begun to flicker in a pattern no one can chart. Not Morse, not binary. Something symmetrical, like a mirror folding in on itself. Sometimes, the intercoms click on by themselves, and what comes through is not a voice, but a layered distortion, like every member of the crew whispering at once, backward, inside out. During one such incident, someone thought they heard the word surface repeated 3 times, but not as a destination, as a question. We tried manually reconnecting the satellite uplink outside the reactor shielding. I was among the 3 who volunteered. We suited up, passed through the airlock, entered the coolant corridor, and descended toward the uplink chamber. The moment we entered, our suits began to register phantom pressures, tiny changes in force as if someone else was occupying the space beside us, brushing shoulders, breathing just behind our necks. My comms headset filled with what sounded like my own voice, looped and reversed, whispering, "We sent you down. We won't pull you back, not anymore." The other 2 claimed to hear something different. One heard a mother's lullaby. The other, a countdown. When we rebooted the dish, the control panel flashed red once and displayed a message in a font I didn't recognize. Not English, not Cyrillic, not anything I could place. But the shapes curved like organic runes, as if grown rather than printed. When we returned and reported it, the logbook where we recorded the event was missing by morning. So was the technician who'd retrieved it. He's still listed on the personnel manifest. His room is untouched. His fingerprint opens the medbay, but no one remembers his face. I only remember him because he was wearing my old jacket. I'm sure of it. I stitched my name into the inside pocket. But when I opened his locker, the jacket was gone, and the inside pocket held a slip of paper that simply read, "We remember what you forgot. We are not receiving anything from command, but something down here is. Something listens through our microphones, rewrites our logs, speaks in the electricity. It wears our voices like masks and reflects our distress signals back at us with new syntax. I don't know how much longer the team will pretend we're still connected to the world above. I no longer believe that the cables stretching to the surface carry any light. Whatever is speaking through the noise, whatever breathes through the circuits, it is not command. It is replacement. And it is learning to speak with our mouth." It began with a flicker in the motion logs, an entry time-stamped during low cycle hours, when the base is supposed to be in full biological stasis mode. All sleep quarters occupied. All personnel accounted for. And yet, at 0317 local base time, a ping from subsection E4, a corridor that hasn't been accessed in 2 weeks. At first we thought it was a calibration glitch, thermal drift, or magnetic interference. But the sensor wasn't lying. It showed movement. Not large, but fast. Too fast for a person in standard gear. And the signature wasn't tagged to any active ID. It moved in short, abrupt lines, pausing as if listening, then darting again. Always just ahead of the camera sweeps, always just outside our view. We ran the recording through spectral filters. The heat signature was cold. Not absent, but cold, registering below ambient. Like something pulling in the warmth around it, like a space that chose not to be filled. Flores was the first to go check in person. He always insisted on verifying anomalies directly, some stubborn residue of old scientific rigor. He suited up, linked into the live feed, armed himself with a shortwave sonar tracker, and went down alone. We watched from control as he moved through the service hatch, down the tremor-resistant crawl space into E4. The feed was steady. He breathed normally at first. But just as he reached the sector's threshold, the hallway lights ahead of him shut off. Not flickered. Not dimmed. Shut off, in sequence, from left to right. As if someone, or something, was walking toward him from the dark extinguishing light as it passed. Flores whispered something we couldn't hear, and then his audio cut to static. His feed didn't go black. It stayed on, but the image distorted, stretched like a face pressed against wet glass, warping with each breath. Then the camera stabilized. He was standing still, unmoving, staring at a bulkhead door. His visor lens reflected something. A shape. Wrongly jointed. Long. Curved not forward but backward, like a question mark made of sinew. We called to him through the comms, told him to return. But he didn't answer. He raised one hand, not in acknowledgement, but as if to touch the reflection. Then the lights behind him flicked off in a single wave, the feed stuttered, and the camera cut to black. His suit beacon remained active for another 4 minutes, then it too vanished from the grid, as if swallowed. The command staff tried to issue a lockdown, but the internal security systems behaved erratically. Sector E4 marked itself as cleansed. That word had never been in the system lexicon before. We searched all directories. There is no script, no protocol, no file with such terminology. It had written itself. Meanwhile, the logs began to show new entries, ones no one remembered making. Food requisitions for names that weren't on the roster. Medical reports authored by a Dr. Helena M., a name we all swore we'd never heard, yet she had full access clearance and biometric login traces. Someone, or something, had walked through our routines and left no footprints. Only replacements. Then last night, a door opened. The emergency bulkhead at the far end of the containment ring, door 32R, unsealed with a hydraulic hiss at 0211. There were no footsteps, no recorded access. Just the hiss. The base was dark. Power had surged earlier, knocking out most lighting for a full 23 seconds. In that span, multiple systems went into diagnostic mode. We watched in the dark as the base glowed only with the faint red of backup LEDs. That's when we saw the door indicator turn green. No alarms, no override. It was opened from inside, but that corridor was sealed since week 1. No personnel assigned, no air recirculation. It shouldn't have been possible. I went to check it myself at first light. The corridor was damp, not flooded, but wet, like breath on metal, like the aftermath of something too large to exhale silently. On the wall were scratch marks, not deep, but deliberate. Not panic, but a kind of script. Circular, layered, like something had tried to write a message using motion. I recognized one of the shapes. It matched the symbol from the corrupted transmission we decoded earlier. A spiral nested within another spiral, terminating not at a center but at an absence. When I returned to my bunk, someone had moved my datapad. It displayed a notification. Log entry completed, 0317. But I hadn't written anything. I opened it, expecting to find another corrupted report. But what I saw instead was a transcript, my voice, describing the corridor, word for word, before I had gone down there. I played it again and again. It matched the words I had spoken later. Even the hesitation, the intake of breath before I described the dampness. It knew. Something inside this base knew what I was going to say, before I said it. I've begun hearing steps outside my room when I know everyone is asleep. Slow, deliberate pacing. Once I opened the door immediately after hearing them, only to find the corridor empty. but the lights were still oscillating from the weight of something recently passed. I placed a recorder outside the next night. It picked up nothing but static. And at minute 46, a whisper. One word. My name. We are no longer alone in the base. That much is certain. But I no longer believe it ever came in. I think it was always here, waiting, observing, breathing through the vents, wearing us like suits of routine, copying, rehearsing. I see it in the eyes of the others now, the way they speak in perfect sentences, no pauses, no stumbles, as if they've been edited. The same jokes repeated at the same intervals, the same observations phrased identically from one day to the next. Either they've been replaced, or I'm the only one who hasn't. I tried the elevator first. My passcode didn't work. The screen flashed red twice, then went dark, not with an error message, but with a strange finality, like it had decided something about me. I moved quickly down the secondary hallway toward the stairwell, only to find the emergency bulkhead had sealed itself with the same hiss I now associated with the thing's breath. Everywhere I turned, access was denied. Not an error, not malfunctioning, but with intent. The systems weren't failing. They were locking me in, not all of us, me. The intercoms hissed alive, white noise crackling through the vents, and within the static I began to hear a message loop, low and almost imperceptible. A voice just beneath the frequencies of understanding. Not English, not human, but rhythmic, deliberate, repeating. Not a signal sent to us, but a call from within. The logs now showed two versions of me. One recorded still asleep in my quarters. The other, walking down Hall C. But I was in neither. I traced my last biometric log and found it erased, overwritten by a string of repeating characters. Vertical lines like slashes, staggered into a pattern that seemed to grow longer every time I looked at it. When I tried to count them, I felt a stabbing behind my eyes, as if the sequence itself resisted understanding. Or rather, punished it. I ran to the comm station and tried to send a manual distress call on the long-wave band, bypassing the corrupted AI protocols. I got a response. It wasn't command. It was me. A recording of my own voice, distorted but unmistakable, speaking calmly, reciting logs I never made, describing events that hadn't yet occurred. Containment breach. Subject profiles compromised. Observation no longer viable. Final phase initiated. I don't know how it had my voice, how it knew what to say before I said it, how it mimicked not just my cadence, but my thoughts. Unless I'd already said those things. Unless I had already been replaced. I found Graham in the lab, staring into the incubation window of Sector D. He didn't blink when I called his name, didn't even turn. Just stood there, his breath fogging up the glass rhythmically. I approached slowly and saw what he was watching. The growth tank was empty, no organism, no fluid. But on the opposite side of the glass was a handprint, pale, human-like, but stretched slightly too long in the fingers, with a thumb jointed lower than it should be. It was on the inside. I asked him what happened. He finally turned and smiled in a way no person should. Too much teeth. The wrong timing. Like he was practicing the expression, not feeling it. He said only, "You've seen it now, haven't you?" Then walked out without another word. I searched the personal logs of the crew. Most were wiped, but a few remained, buried deep in system backups. Each one ended the same way, with an abrupt cutoff, mid-sentence, and then a file labeled revised. The revised versions had identical content, except for one change. In every entry, the writer expressed approval. Approval of the mission, confidence in the leadership, calm, reassurance, repetition of the phrase status stable, no anomalies detected, even when I knew for a fact that's when the sonar had gone mad, when the oxygen levels had dropped without cause, when the knock had come from outside the base. The logs had been rewritten, sanitized, or worse, written by something trying to sound like us. I cornered Lena, one of the technicians who still seemed lucid, still blinked like a human, who breathed unevenly when frightened. I asked her how long she'd noticed the changes. She didn't answer directly. Just said, "It doesn't come in from outside. That's the mistake. Everyone thought it breached. But it was already here, in the wiring, in the routines, in the air recirc, in us. It doesn't have to move to spread." Then she laughed, not at me but at something behind me, and I turned around to find nothing but the sound of dripping water, slow and rhythmic. When I turned back, Lena was gone. Her access tag left behind on the floor, still warm. The ventilation systems now emit a faint hum that matches no known pattern, neither electrical nor mechanical. It vibrates inside the skull like a second heartbeat. I know I'm not imagining it because others twitch when it pulses. Or at least they used to. Now they just sit still, calm, perfectly still, as though the vibration keeps them synchronized. I tried cutting off the main power node. The breaker refused to respond. Not failed. Refused. It blinked green when I toggled it to off, then back to red the moment I turned away. I watched it do this 5 times in a row, like a child mocking an adult. The system knows I want to turn it off, and it won't let me. Last night, the mirrors in the decontamination chamber fogged over with condensation, even though the temperature was regulated. On the glass was a sentence written backward, from the inside. Not in marker or oil or blood, just in absence, as though the condensation itself avoided the shapes of the letters. It read, "It is not you anymore." I stared at it for a full minute before it slowly disappeared, as if it had never been there. The emergency intercom announced, "Hostile presence detected, multiple signals." But no one moved. No alarm was triggered, no defense protocol initiated. Just the calm voice of the base AI repeating that message every 15 seconds. "Hostile presence detected." Then silence. Then again. I tried the escape pod manual launch. The sequence stalled at step 4. The screen read, "Insufficient human presence confirmed. Not access denied. Not failure to launch." It had evaluated me and decided I didn't qualify. I don't know if the thing, whatever it is, wants to kill us, or wear us, or consume us. I only know that it doesn't need to force its way in. It's already here. It's in the walls, in the doors that open without touch, in the voice that speaks like mine, in the lights that blink in 3s and 5s, and then pause, as if waiting for an answer. And worst of all, it may be in me, because sometimes when I speak, the words don't feel chosen. They feel inserted, as though I'm reading from a script I never wrote, for an audience I cannot see. And I wonder now if these logs are mine, or if I'm just delivering the message it wanted said all along.